My name is Hannah, and New Year's Eve has always been a time of joy and celebration for me. But the events that unfolded as we welcomed 2021 turned a night of festivities into a nightmare that continues to haunt my dreams. It began with an invitation from my friend Julia to spend New Year's Eve at her family's old estate. The house was a beautiful yet imposing mansion, nestled in the countryside and rumored to have a dark past. Julia assured us that the stories were just local legends, and we were all excited for a night of fun. The group consisted of 5 friends: Julia, Mike, Sarah, Tom, and me. We arrived at the mansion in the late afternoon, greeted by the sight of its grand facade, illuminated by the setting sun. Inside, the house was even more impressive, with ornate furniture, elegant chandeliers, and a sense of history that seemed to permeate every room. As the evening wore on, we laughed, danced, and toasted to the new year. Midnight approached, and we gathered in the grand parlor, ready to count down the final seconds of the year. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked ominously, its pendulum swinging with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Just as the clock struck 12, a sudden chill filled the room. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy with an oppressive silence. The final chime of the clock echoed through the house, and we felt a collective shiver run down our spines. Julia tried to laugh it off, but her voice wavered. "It's just the old wiring. Don't worry, guys." But her reassurances did little to dispel the growing sense of dread. Moments later, we heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the hallway. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as if someone, or something, was approaching. Mike and Tom, ever the skeptics, decided to investigate, leaving the rest of us huddled together in the parlor. Minutes passed and the tapping stopped. We called out to Mike and Tom, but there was no response. Panic set in as we realized they had been gone for too long. Sarah suggested we all stick together and search for them, but fear held us in place. The grandfather clock chimed again and the lights flickered once more. This time, the air grew even colder, and we heard the unmistakable sound of whispering, soft, urgent voices that seemed to come from all around us. Julia's face went pale as she recognized the language. "It's Latin," she whispered. "They're chanting." Desperate to find our friends and escape the house, we mustered the courage to leave the parlor. As we stepped into the hallway, we saw Mike and Tom standing at the far end, their faces devoid of emotion. They turned to look at us, their eyes hollow and empty. "Mike, Tom, are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. They didn't respond, only continued to stare with a vacant intensity. Then, in unison, they began to walk towards us, their movements stiff and unnatural. We backed away, fear gripping us as we realized something was terribly wrong. Julia grabbed my arm and whispered urgently, "We need to get out of here. Now." We turned and ran through the maze-like corridors of the mansion, the whispering voices growing louder with each step. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. Finally, we reached the front door and flung it open, stumbling out into the cold night air. As we drove away, the mansion loomed behind us, its windows dark and empty. Mike and Tom were never found, and the police dismissed our story as hysteria brought on by the night's events. But I know what I saw, and the memory of that night continues to haunt me. It all started on New Year's Eve, 2019. I remember it vividly, not just because of the terror that followed, but because it was supposed to be a night of joy and celebration. My name is Rachel, and I had no idea that night would change me forever. My boyfriend, Sam, and I had been invited to a small gathering at an old, isolated house owned by his friend, Nick. Nick had recently inherited the house from his late uncle, who had passed under mysterious circumstances. The house was a sprawling Victorian mansion, perched on the edge of a dense forest. It was beautiful in a way that made you uneasy, with its ornate turrets and cracked, ivy-covered walls. We arrived just before sunset. The house loomed above us, its windows reflecting the fading light like dark, unblinking eyes. Inside, the atmosphere was strange. Nick had done his best to decorate, but the sheer size of the house swallowed any attempt at warmth. There were 8 of us in total, and while we were all excited to celebrate, I could sense an undercurrent of unease among the group. The house felt alive, as though it was watching us. The centerpiece of the living room was an enormous grandfather clock, its face worn and hands stained a deep red as if rusted, or worse. Nick told us it was one of the few items in the house that had been left behind by his uncle. "Don't touch it," Nick joked nervously. "The thing's been broken for years. Chimes at weird times like it's stuck in its own little world." We all laughed it off, though the idea unsettled me. Midnight couldn't come fast enough. As the evening wore on, the air in the house seemed to grow heavier, colder. The sound of the wind outside felt muffled, as though the house itself was swallowing the noise. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps upstairs, but Nick assured us no one else was in the house. At 11:45, we all gathered in the living room for the countdown. The lights dimmed slightly, which Nick explained was just old wiring. We started the countdown at 10 seconds to midnight, our voices loud and joyous. 3, 1, Happy New Year. That's when the grandfather clock struck. The first chime was so loud it seemed to reverberate through my bones. Then came the second chime. Then the third. By the 12th chime we were all frozen. The room was pitch dark except for the dim glow of the clock's face, which now shone a sickly green. A low whisper filled the room. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, distinct. It was a voice, or many voices, chanting something I couldn't understand. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, slithering along the walls like living things. "What the hell is happening?" Sam shouted, but no one could answer. The whispers turned to screams, high-pitched and guttural. Nick grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the clock. The hands of the clock were spinning wildly, faster and faster, until they stopped abruptly at 12:13. The glow from the clock faded, and the room fell silent. When the lights flickered back on, two of us were gone, Nick and Sarah. We called out for them, searched every room, but they had vanished. Their phones, their jackets, everything was still in the living room. We tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had locked us in. That's when we noticed it, a small mark like a burn on each of our wrists. It looked like a clock face, the hands pointing to 12:13. The rest of the night was a blur. We heard footsteps echoing in the hallways, saw fleeting shadows darting just out of view. At one point, I swear I saw Nick standing at the top of the staircase, but his eyes were wrong, empty black pits that seemed to pull the light out of the room. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, the door finally opened. We stumbled out, half-crazed with fear. Nick and Sarah were never found. The police chalked it up to a drunken night gone wrong, but we knew better.